All right, thanks for coming tonight. And Theresa and I will be going through this, and we're gonna, I think we'll just get started. Thanks for that introduction, Paula. So I think Paula did a great job with the introductions. I don't have anything to add for myself. Theresa?
Yeah, so I am a content strategist. I work with Factor. Gary is one of my clients, and these are my website here. I did want to say that when Gary and I were talking about this presentation and we were trying to figure out who was going to do what, I told Gary that he had to be the one to put on his makeup and look pretty. So that's what he'll be doing tonight, and I'll be doing the heavy lifting of the presentation.
So one of the reasons we wanted to talk about this, I mean, Theresa has a deep background in content strategy. My background is really with larger scale information architecture and taxonomy projects. But especially in the past few years, it's become really clear that those projects are heavily dependent on there being a good, solid content strategy. There is a fair amount of IA and taxonomy work that can be done in the absence of it. But for large organizations where this work is going to be strategic, we need to know where this is going. Otherwise, you sort of hit a wall with what you can do for your IA and your taxonomies. So we just really wanted to get the point across that, you know, a lot of our projects are in this area, but we're more and more finding ourselves to be heavily dependent on our clients having a solid content strategy in place or working with them to develop that content strategy. And what we're finding is that without the content strategy, no one knows where to go. You get a point where you just can't make any decisions because you've got so much, once you get into an enterprise, there's just so much complexity and so many things go in different directions. So what we're really trying to do, what the content strategy is really doing is at least telling all the different parts which direction we're trying to go. It doesn't necessarily tell each part what to do, but at least it's letting us all figure out what the taxonomies need to do, what the metadata needs to do, what the experiences need to do, so we can build those things out under one umbrella as opposed to a whole bunch of people going in different directions.
Right, and before we dive into the meat of our presentation, we just wanted to acknowledge that we're standing on the shoulders of giants here when we talk about enterprise content strategy. We'll be focused on the enterprise aspect of content strategy, but of course, we couldn't have gotten this far without our peers who we've learned from, read from, and heard present at different conferences. On the next slide, I have a list of some content strategy books, but I think you can annotate in Zoom. So maybe if you can get your annotation tool ready, I have a question for you. So these are some of the books that we would recommend reading if anybody wanted to learn more about content strategy. This being a CS group, I think that maybe you've probably already read these, but we just wanted to list here that these are some great books that we really drew from. And the question I wanted to ask is a very taxonomy related question. Which one of these things is not like the others? Can you spot it? And if so, why don't you annotate it? I'll give you a second or two.
And this was just to show the richness of the field that we're working in. This was just a screenshot from a search. We just did a search for content strategy books, and I just took a screenshot of part of it. I didn't curate a whole lot. It's just like, we just want to really make it clear that there's a lot of work that's been done in the area of content strategy itself. And we're just really, hopefully tonight, going to talk about some of the things we've learned about what it means to do this in a large scale enterprise.
That's right. So yeah, it's the Inc. startup money. So funny. Anyway, I thought that was fun. All right. So talking about the enterprise level, we'll tell you what we mean by that. And whenever I think of enterprise, I always think of the Starship Enterprise. These are the voyages. But actually, I had this picture in here and I was like, oh, I just think of that. And Gary said, actually, that's a really good analogy, is that making a Starship enterprise function is enormously complex. And I've always wondered about this. You know, you're supposed to suspend your disbelief when you are watching these sci-fi shows, but I always think about, how do they create fake gravity? How do they create air? How do they have enough food for hundreds of people for years on end, where they could like never find any planet where they could recharge any of their supplies? How do they get enough dilithium crystals? What's the supply chain like to get all of these things to make a ship? What are the standards, the policies, the procedures, and how many languages do they have to translate it into? And then how do they pay for all this stuff? How do they agree on a monetary standard? And how do they exchange money across galaxies, or, you know, I don't know. Anyway, so it represents just how complex an enterprise level can be. So when we talk about enterprise content strategy, we are talking about the connection between your business priorities and the internal and external content-driven experiences that support them. So Gary and I really focus on content and making content happen. An effective enterprise content strategy guides how every part of your organization creates, shares, and accesses content to support the overall business goal. So regardless of team and regardless of where they're publishing it, for example, the processes need to be specific, repeatable, and measurable. So what is the person supposed to do? How do they do it over and over again? And how do we measure what they're doing and the success of it so that we can continue to improve? And of course, the strategy has to address user needs, organizational maturity and readiness, technology, business goals, and compliance. And we'll talk about these things more as we go through this presentation.
It's like Theresa said, our focus is for this, in a lot of our work, is really on doing this in an enterprise environment. And when we say enterprise, what we really mean is initiatives that span, that just encompass a huge amount of complexity. They span multiple technical systems. Multiple business units might be involved. So there's a lot of politics and organizational readiness that's involved. Understanding user profiles. There's often internal and external user profiles. There's partners, there's vendors, there's new customers and old customers. All these different things that we need to understand. The different experiences involved. There might be digital experiences, in-person experiences, experiences for the analytics team. All of those things are going to reflect and utilize information that's coming out of that's being driven by the content strategy. Perhaps most important when we think about these initiatives, though, is that we really need to understand what their business cases are. Like, we need, an enterprise project like this really needs to have a business case that calls out at a high level how all this complexity needs to work together.
Yep, sorry. Shoot.
So this is an example. Oh,
there you go.
There we go.
Sorry.
This is an example of what we mean by enterprise. This is sort of a summary of one of the projects we're currently working on. And, there we go.
Sorry, having problems.
So the content strategy really needs to span all these systems and stakeholders. It needs to be able to take into account the needs of all the different places the content's going to be delivered, all the different ways it's going to be delivered, and then also the needs of the different internal and external audiences that are going to be using it. I have the CMS and the DAM system here in bold, because that's generally where the focus of a lot of this content lives. But in these more complex environments, we're often pulling things from the product information management system, which is referred to as the PIM, or the ERP or the PLM. PLM stands for product lifecycle management. So depending on how far you're going to go back into the product lifecycle to be pulling information that you're sending to different stakeholders, you might need to go back into some of those systems that might still be running on COBOL. And these sources are also coming from various stakeholders. They might be suppliers or vendors, your marketing team, Legal often has a lot of requirements around this, especially if you're in a compliance-driven industry. So those are the types of things that really, when we say enterprise, this is sort of the scenario that we're thinking about, is how do we herd all these cats into one story?
All right. So some components of enterprise content strategy. We have what we would call editorial content strategy and technical content strategy. So the editorial focuses on the creation and curation of content with which the end users interact, and it's focused on the goals and message of the content and how it should be delivered consistently across channels. And the technical content focuses on orchestrating the content experience infrastructure. So content management, the content management system, taxonomies, the metadata, integrations with other systems, just like Gary was showing in the previous slide, search, what search is going to look like, how it's going to work. And all of this is meant to support the editorial strategy and goals and support the end user experience as well. I think, Gary, do you want to say anything about this slide?
No, I'll take the next one though.
Okay.
So so along with the editorial content strategy, which is where a lot of the content strategy work really is focused, and the technical work, which is around how we orchestrate that, there's some foundational layers that need to be in place in terms of having governance and having the information, having your information layer. And when we talk about governance, we're really talking about how the content itself is going to be governed, and how the metadata, the taxonomies, and the workflows are governed. Because in these types of environments, the taxonomies and metadata are really what are stitching together all these different systems. And workflows are often heavily dependent on content and processes that span multiple systems. So we found that all of those things really need to be under a good governance regime in order to keep everything working. And the information layer is how we refer to your model, your overall models for your taxonomies, your metadata, your content types. We refer to this information layer as something that needs to be modeled in and of itself. It needs to be handled as something that doesn't belong to a particular system or different group. This is where you're describing your product list, your customers, your segmentation, your sales regions. We see those all as enterprise assets that need to be modeled in one place and then represented in these different systems and experiences. And one of the things we found in this foundational layer is that it really depends on the maturity of an enterprise as to how far they can take how far they can go with these information architecture and content strategy initiatives. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we mean by maturity, but I'm not going to dig into it too much. We can go to the next slide. So one of the ways we think about maturity as for an organization as a process that people move through. And we have more about this on our website, but really we see organizations moving through these different phases where they start with this accidental, where there is no real content strategy. This group or this system might do this group or this system might do that. If you need to do any reporting or analytics across these systems, it's really just done on a completely ad hoc basis. Every email, every piece of content is just about as a new adventure. Then we move to Grassroots, where a lot of the SMEs, the folks in these systems, are realizing that it could be better. And through a lot of personal heroics of these folks, they can start stitching these together. This is also where we see some of the executives saying, why is this stuff so hard? And so you start seeing it on both ends of the spectrum there. And then emerging is really like we're starting with some projects. We're stitching some of these tools together. We're building a strategy maybe for our email or maybe for this channel here. We're building all those things together. And so we're starting to see some real progress. And stage 4 is when we've really started to align across the organization, and we've started to drive the content strategy at an enterprise level as opposed to an initiative level. And this is where we're really starting to see governance take hold and starting to drive processes. And then stage 5, it's unclear even that companies need to get to stage 5, but this is where your content strategy is really your business strategy and your executive strategy. These things start to become very heavily entwined. You're not fighting for resources for content strategy because it's so heavily involved in what everybody's doing. And this is sort of an outline of how we think about the maturity of organizations as they embark on these types of projects.
Yeah, and I would also add that different teams or departments can be at different stages of this model, and that it's about, we would evaluate where each team is at, but also try to move the organization as a whole through this model. And I'll go to the next slide.
Yeah, and so just an example of how this plays out when this doesn't happen. This was from a project we did a few years ago, and here we have just an example of one product that was represented differently in 3 different areas. One of these is a picture from their paper catalog. We've got a hang tag that was in their store, and then we've got information that was on their website. And we found lots of these examples, and part of this was because they had different systems and different groups creating content for these different channels. And so this is the place where, in order for us to have an effective content strategy, they needed to reorganize or rethink the way they even created the content at an HR level and their org structure. So, it's something as basic as product naming or how our product information that's going out to our clients, what required, deeper integration of systems, purchasing of new systems, reorganizing, reorgs of the content creation teams, all of that. Yeah, and so as Theresa, the slide here shows, we really need to dig into a lot of what's going on in the organization, the full breadth of the organization, to get something that's really going to address these enterprise issues.
All right. So now we've talked about what we mean by enterprise and the enterprise level issues. We'll talk about our unified enterprise content strategy, as we call it. And we've got this visual for you where we'll go through each of these parts and explain it. We're going to focus on the middle section here for our talk, but we'll go through each of these parts. So what we're trying to illustrate here is basically how the business strategy, the initiatives, and the user research drive the technical content strategy, the editorial content strategy, and the governance of these things. Then we have the governance and information layers that support the technical and editorial content strategies, and these different experiences and outputs that are supported by the content strategy. So we're going to break apart each of these sections and talk about it in more detail. Gary will do the first section, and then I'll do the following sections.
So this first area here we found is it's just essential for these types of things, because the work that we do goes through so many different parts of an organization. We really need to be able to articulate why we're talking to such a wide range of stakeholders, by really understanding what is the business problem we're trying to solve. And this isn't like these aren't business problems like, oh, my emails aren't going out fast enough. These are more higher level, executive level business problems. We need to improve engagement. Average order value needs to be increased. We need to keep up with this competitive landscape. Those are the types of things that we want to understand so that we can pull out the role of content and information in addressing those things and use that as the lens for the rest of our work. Once we know that business strategy that we're tying into Then we start to look at the different initiatives that are involved. What is the sales team doing to address that? What's marketing? What are the analytics team doing? All of these things, all these organizations, all these groups will likely have initiatives that tie up to that. And the content strategy and the information architecture is really what's going to allow those things to get stitched together. And then we put user research in here because it is so fundamentally important for any of these projects, even on like the driest analytics-driven taxonomy project that we've ever worked on. Doing good user research with internal and external stakeholders, depending on the scope of the project, is just always essential for making sure that when we get something, when we've got a good strategy and we've designed a good information model, that it's going to actually meet the needs of this audience, as opposed to going off and building something that doesn't take that into account. So yeah, for anyone who has a hard time arguing for the user research, I just keep arguing for it. It pays for itself over and over and over again.
Yeah. The other thing I'd like to highlight is that when we talk about the business strategy elements and enterprise content strategy, we're not trying to boil the ocean here. So if we think about enterprise level content strategy, it's a huge area. There's a lot of content that an enterprise produces for many, many reasons. You know, in the past, our projects have started off with the client wants to do this thing. And in order to do it, we do the research into why do you want to do that thing? What are some initiatives in the different departments that this thing is supporting, or why do they need this thing done? And what are the users doing? Will the user activity support this thing that they want to do? So we can look at something, pinpoint an issue and start there, and then grow the enterprise content strategy out further. So say, for example, we have an information model that we want to create. We can start with the CMS. We can do a content audit on the CMS. We can move to the DAM. We can spread it out further because it solves some business problem and supports these teams in different ways, and it also helps us give a better user experience. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide, which is on this screen. All right, so here we have our content strategy elements. And I would say that Gary and I are heavily on the technical content strategy side. But I have a lot of coworkers and past experience in the editorial side. And of course, I've read everything I could about it. So we can talk to that a little bit. And of course, we can talk about it in the Q&A at the end. So when we think of technical content strategy, this is really what's happening in the systems, the CMS, the DAM, PIM, whatever you have that makes metadata taxonomy content function to support the editorial experience. So what's the content model? What different content types are you going to have, and what metadata is going to go along with it? Once you identify your metadata, which metadata is driven by taxonomy? Once you have the taxonomy, how do you tag that content? How much content do you tag? How far back do you go? How do you go through the process of retagging? And what is the tagging going to support? Is it going to support search, dynamic content display? Is it going to support sharing information or content between systems? How is the performance of the content measured, or the performance of the taxonomy or metadata measured? What do the search results look like? Are those search results accurate and effective? How can the taxonomy, the metadata be optimized to improve the performance of the search, improve the content experience for users on whatever digital platform you're using? What systems are involved? So Gary had that slide about CMS, a DAM, a PIM, and what vendors are involved, what systems do they use? How do we need to interact with those systems? There are many where you get product specs from one company and you want to use it in another. So how does REI or mech get all of the product information that they use? Do they have to type it in, or can they get it from a supplier, vendor? How do you manage all these systems? How do you keep track of the metadata across these systems? How do you ensure that they can share metadata and taxonomy? And then how do you continue to onboard channels? So like I said, we don't start with boiling the ocean. We start with one or two systems, and then if we have an information model for that system, then how do we onboard other channels or digital properties to that metadata? How do we use, like what more taxonomy terms do they need? How will they be using the same taxonomy differently? How can we accommodate their needs? Who needs to review this stuff? So who creates the content? Or maybe I should go to the editorial side first. So I find that the editorial content strategy really, really drives what you're doing with the metadata and the taxonomy. So what strategy does the content support? When is the content created? Who is the target audience? If you know who the target audience is, then you can have values in your taxonomy. You can use those values to tag your content and then drive a personalized experience or dynamic content based off of who you're trying to target. But if you don't know who you're trying to target, then what appears in your taxonomy is probably not as effective as it can be. Where is the content published? Is it in the CMS? Is it in the DAM? Is it in social media? How are the different users going to be accessing this content, and what does it need to look like in that system? What content should be created, of course, goes to the user needs, and based on what content you're creating, you can have metadata and taxonomy to support that. So say a topics taxonomy is a perfect example of what you're talking about. And that kind of taxonomy can help support your content, dynamic content display, personalization, search, and it also, forgot what I was going to say. When is it published? When can it be published? Are there any, you cannot publish before dates? How do we incorporate that workflow? And then, of course, how are new channels onboarded into your editorial content strategy? One thing that I always talk about with people is plain language, that when you think about who your users are, what you're talking about, you basically, you're creating content to target that user. And different channels have different users and different content writing standards. So when you onboard a channel into your editorial content strategy, you would consider questions like that. Whereas when you onboard new channels into your technical content strategy, you would consider what metadata do they need, what additional content types do they need, what taxonomies are going to be affected, and what system is that channel in. How are you going to update the metadata in that system? How are you going to publish content in that system or rewrite what's there? So in the middle of all of this, we have these people who are interacting together. And sometimes that can be the hardest part. Who creates the content, who publishes the content, who owns and manages it. And all of this stuff, there's a back and forth between the technical and the editorial side. So we want to make sure that the taxonomists and information architects are supporting the editorial strategy, that the workflow that we have built into our systems helps that publishing process, that the people doing all of this work know how to go through these processes, and then who owns and manages it. While an editorial content strategist, a writer, an editor, a managing editor could manage the look, the feel of the content, the way it's written, there might be a subject matter expert who is responsible for the technical accuracy of that content. So how do you interact with that person? How do you keep track of that person? In a large organization, that subject matter expert might change a lot, or they might leave the company and you'll never know it because it's such a large organization. And then when do you take that content down? What are those standards? And that would come from your editorial content strategy, but also when you take content down, it does affect your taxonomies, your systems, the performance, and you need to continue to maintain your taxonomies, your metadata, so you don't have things in your technical content strategy that are not being used. And then at the bottom of that, we have the governance and the information layer. So the governance, it applies to both technical and editorial content strategy. And the information layer would span all of the systems that you have. So like I said, if you have this unified information model that sets out your metadata for the whole organization, then that really underpins your technical and editorial content strategy. And it can be used by different systems to help support what you're trying to do with your content.
And I think, these questions that have been put together here are really the results of, a lot of work in these types of clients. And, we've got them here in this graphic, but these are really the types of questions that are driving our discovery process. And I recommend, I highly recommend that as you're working on these types of projects, start asking these types of questions. And because these are going to start to uncover where your organization is from a maturity perspective and what you can actually get done. One thing that comes up in these projects is really understanding the true cost of executing on your content strategy. How much does it actually cost to create a piece of content, manage it, govern it over time, deliver, tag it correctly, keep those tags up to date? All of those questions are going to come out on this. And this is one of the things that we think can help projects be successful, even if it means scaling them down significantly. And this is where understanding your organizational maturity really comes into play. If your organization's not gonna fund a role to manage the tag quality on your high value content, and that really tells you what it is. That's neither good nor bad. It just is what it is, but it means your content strategy has to adjust to that level of, the appropriate level of effort that can get put into it. Same thing with your taxonomy and metadata management. If your organization has a taxonomist and a team that's managing metadata across systems, then you've got a much better chance of being able to pull off a omni-channel project, personalization, deep analytics projects. If they don't, then you want to use that information to scale back and figure out what can be done rather than just banging your head against a wall.
Yeah. So, for example, when I do content strategy projects, like right now, I'm doing a content strategy project, but I'm mostly focused on the information architecture, the metadata, and the taxonomy. And the company I'm working with, they have their own communications team. They know how to write, but the thing that they don't know how to do is work with the subject matter experts to get the information, but then publish it in plain language for their audience. So when I work with these people, there's always a discovery phase of what is the actual problem, what taxonomies do we have, what's the page structure, what's the content look like, who are the users, and doing user research to find out what they actually need versus what's on the site, and bringing that all together, reflecting it to the organization, but also seeing that when you reflect it to the organization, you also see what they have the appetite for, right? Like if I say to this company, you need to write in plain language, and the business champions say, yes, we need to do that, then that's going to happen. It's more likely to happen. You have more leverage in working with subject matter experts. If I say you need to have all the content in plain language, and they say, well, fine, but we're only going to do that for the general public. For these, these members that come to our site, they should know what we're talking about when we use all this jargon. then you know that where you can focus, say on the editorial side, and you could also sneak in some content usability testing, right? Can these members who are supposed to be subject matter experts, say like they're accountants, right? And you have like a CPA website with a whole bunch of information on it. You could test your content to see if subject matter experts actually, or these users actually know what you're talking about when you use all this jargon. So, you know, you could be sneaky about it, sneak something in there. But doing a kind of stakeholder alignment workshop or reporting out your findings to a group at large and taking feedback can help you discover what they have the appetite for.
Theresa, I wanted to interject one question that's in the chat because it's germane to this slide. Charlene asked, how is a content model different from a metadata model?
Oh, yeah. My friend Kathy and I, who's a content strategist, ongoing debate about this, and I think we've settled on a metadata model. I would just say it's all of your metadata for whatever system you have. You might also call it an information model, metadata model. So it just lists all of your standard, for me, it lists all of your standardized metadata regardless of which system it's in. A content model, and I think I'm going to get this right, a content model identifies the different content types that you need on your website or in your DAM. And if it's on your website, then it identifies the metadata that goes along with that particular content type, as well as the on-page structure of the content. So what does the, so on a like a topic detail page, you're going to have a title, you're going to have a short description, you're going to have a subheading, you're going to have another paragraph. If you want to use an image, you always have to have alt text with it. You always have to have a description with it. So to restate it, the content types are the different types of content you have on your site. And then each one of those, it could be like a content type could be a topic detail page, a landing page, an event page, a news page. And each of those different pages is going to have different metadata that it needs and different on-page structure for the content that's in it. So an event would have a start, end, dates, and time, but a news article wouldn't. The news might have like topic and a byline name, but an event wouldn't have a byline. In your metadata model, it would show all of those fields, but you would only use it on certain content types in your, say, in your CMS.
And the metadata model might also be used to provide the attributes you need for analytics reports. Like you might have a definition of an analytics report, and you know that if it's using certain attributes or pieces of metadata in that report, you could then see which types of content or information also shared that, so you could use that in that analytics report. We've also had projects where we pull these things together to drive like for compliance and regulatory issues. You know, here's the attributes that are necessary to drive compliance and regulatory issues. And then by doing this all in one place, you can see which attributes are used where, and that really helps you with your, you know, your reporting, your analytics, you know, measuring the content effectiveness, all of those things across the organization.
Yeah, and you know that those systems using the fields are all talking about the same thing when they're using them. And that's the key part to analytics from a metadata perspective.
Yeah.
Anything else on this slide? You could certainly ask more.
I just want to interject that there were a couple very nice comments in the chat about how much people love this slide, and I would add my compliments to that as well. So.
Thank you. We worked hard on it. A lot of pain and suffering to get here.
Everything in here is representative of a project that went. Something we learned during a project painfully.
Yeah. Okay. We'll just move on. This is your slide. Oh no, this is my slide. Is it? Let's see, it's mine. Okay. So this is really to say that acknowledge how much your content strategy affects downstream experiences and other things. So a lot of people are doing customer experiences, user journeys. How does your content strategy support your customers, your users? How does it support sales experiences? Both, the people buying the products as well as the people trying to sell the products. And interestingly enough, like, how do you create content for people who are selling your products versus people who are buying your products, and what's the difference? What's the support experiences like? I love support websites. Knowledge centers are fascinating websites about all the different particular things that people have problems with. And I started as a technical support analyst, so I know how people really, really struggle with software or products. So how does your content strategy support the support? Because these people, support and tech support analysts, are so hard done by that anything we can do to support them is really, I love it. And then, as Gary mentioned, we have analytics. We have, of course, training, and on a broader level, knowledge management. How does the content support how people are trained internally and externally? How does it support the broader knowledge management initiatives in the organization? And where compliance and regulatory is important, how does your content strategy support that? So I have a lot of government clients, or a lot of those who are regulated by the government, or they're like, we call them crown corporations. They're arm's length from the government, but the government still controls them. And how do they have to report to the government, both in their content and in other things? And how does the government judge what they have, especially in their content? And for example, the project I'm working on, the government has said your content is too complicated for the general public. You need to make it easier. And by the way, your website structure isn't great either. And we're going to rank you poorly if you don't update your website. So that really impacts. I'd say that's a big driver for people not wanting to get fined or sued, what have you.
Yeah, and I think again, an essential part of these projects, all this work that needs to go into it, all this understanding that we need on these in the enterprise. As you start to craft your solutions, understanding the expense of the project, understanding where the maturity of the organization is, all of that comes out of asking all those questions and making sure that you can, do what you can do today, and then put other things on a roadmap to help the project over the future. Because these projects can take years. We've got a client we've been working with for 4 years now as they move through this process.
Yeah, and I had one example. I worked on a knowledge center, and it was truly horrifyingly bad. When I interviewed the customer service reps, they said, whatever you do, so they access the knowledge center through a browser. I said, whatever you do, don't take away Control F, because that's how I find things. And I said to them, I promise you I won't take away Control F. Because it's built into the browser, but that's how bad it was to find content. They would go to a page and it would be 10,000 words. And these are people on phone calls who are getting judged for how long it takes them to solve a problem and get off the phone with somebody. And they're using Control F to go through the page to find information. And the client estimated that, I think, in 1 year, by restructuring the knowledge center and paying X amount of money for it, in 1 year they would save, I think it was $400,000 to $500,000 in time of people on the phone and not being able to take another phone call. And that was a big deal for them when, like, that's a lot of money to save when you're really already trying to watch it because you're regulated by the government. Yeah, in other situations, not so much, but that was one example of where a great content strategy and structure helped that team. In terms of brand, where does brand fit in, Gary? Somebody asked, where does brand fit in? Where or how does brand fit in?
Brand is often one of the drivers in the high level business, at the high level end, at the business end of this, the business strategy. I like to think that the drivers for these projects almost always boil down to increasing revenue, supporting the brand, or operational efficiency. And when I say supporting the brand, that's, for for-profit companies, that's really what we think about as the brand. But for government or NGOs, that's really the mission. But if I can track, when people say, oh, we need to do X, we need to improve search, or we're not getting content out effectively to this audience, I want to keep asking the question of why they need to fix that until I can get to one of those three things. Our brand is, people don't trust us if we can't get this information out quickly enough. Or we're not getting, someone says, oh, my search is broken. Like, well, what's the impact? Oh, well, average order value has gone down since we changed our search algorithms or something like that. Those are the types of things I want to look at in terms of, brand, in branding or efficiency or, again, revenue.
That's all we had. We have our, a slide that shows our faces again. We'll put here. So happy to have questions if you have them.
Thanks, Theresa. Yeah, there were a couple. I want to circle back to a couple. Sorry, let me scroll back up here. Mary had asked, would you consider content marketing part of the editorial strategy? I struggle getting marketers to get involved. They tend to focus on above the line creative and clicks. Yeah,
I think that the content marketing is really, it's definitely one of the things that feeds this. And again, we might never have to talk to them about content strategy or taxonomies or metadata, but we just need to know what they're trying to do with their content, what the content is, who it's getting targeted to. And you can see all of those things are necessary in content marketing, and all those things need to get addressed here. And all of those things are going to have impacts on the information architecture, the taxonomies, and the metadata in order to be able to execute. So whether they know they're part of this process or not depends on the organization, but their input is really important for this type of work, or can be if an organization, again, this gets back to the organizational maturity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would say that they fall under editorial content strategy, but in terms of maturity, sometimes the content marketing teams do whatever they want, and then you're like, oh wow, we have like 15 microsites that we didn't even know about, and now we're supposed to integrate them because content marketing initiative, they wanted their own URL, and 15 to 50 times over. And that can be really tough, but really, like, all the content that you're creating should be under your content strategy, and content marketing is part of your content. So should be driven by your overall goals and initiatives.
To that point, Theresa, I'm curious if you have, either or both of you have good examples of governance models that can rein in the rogue microsite creators.
Well, I think when you have a microsite, well, first of all, I think your content strategy and your web strategy should illustrate the governance behind when to create a microsite. You would have reasons for it. You would have, responsibilities and expiry dates for them. Gary, what do you want to say?
Yeah, I think everything Theresa just said, and as far as the nuts and bolts of the content of the governance itself, it really depends on the organizational structure. We've had projects where everything fell underneath a senior vice president. So we had a pretty big carrot and a pretty big stick for that project. So we were able to create a pretty robust and proactive governance process. I've also had projects where we were working within one group and it had impacts on all these other groups or dependencies with these other groups, like sales and marketing, that we had no control over. So we had to create a governance process that was more reactive. And so it's really, and so in that case, groups would go and do what they were going to do. And then we had a team of folks who were getting analytics and reports of when things had changed. So we could go and figure out which of those changes needed to be updated, needed to be reflected in the overall enterprise, which of those were targeted just for that particular group. It was also a great opportunity to talk to people from those groups to show them when they were actually reinventing content or metadata that already existed elsewhere. So it really opened up a conversation around starting to bring the organization together.
Yeah, I think it's particularly hard when you have something like a university or a very distributed organization. So with universities, it's ad hoc governance. People create whatever sites they want to, as long as they can get onto that CMS server. They create their WordPress install and away they go. But I think in my mind, a website is there to represent the interests of the organization externally to the public, or intranet could be internally, but I realize that universities have a different approach to, independence and academic, whatever you want to call it, integrity. And they feel like they need to do whatever they want to do on the website to showcase their content or whatever they're doing, their activities, and competing with other universities. But at the same time, that website is a reflection and a representation of the organization. And the one thing that I would love to see change is that websites aren't for us to talk about ourselves. They're for us to represent ourselves to the public and show know what they're interested in knowing from us and providing that. Otherwise, you just kind of have an intranet that's available externally.
Yeah, one of the things we like to say is that your content, your taxonomies, your metadata are really, that's how you describe the world that's how you describe yourself to the world. Yeah. Even your navigation schemes. And so you really need to look into those things. Yeah. It looks like there's a question about the ongoing alignment fitting for the governance plan. And, I think this really comes back to the organizational maturity and understanding what's available in terms of doing this and making sure that whatever we create is right sized for the organization. But when we do have the opportunity when an organization does have the maturity to support and govern the content strategy and the IA strategy, there's generally going to be one or more people whose day job it is to oversee this. This has to be somebody's day job. The governance does. And it also needs to be directly tied to one of those high-level business goals, so that that person, so that we know why we're making these changes and enforcing this governance process. But as far as, processes, routines we recommend, certainly, we've done things as concrete as setting up a rigorous process where there's JIRA tickets that get submitted. We've got a published governance process and schedule, so people know what type of changes can be submitted, what the schedule is for reviewing those and making those, what escalation paths are, so that things can move quickly if they need to. Those are all the types of things that go in, but it's really, governance is very personal to the organization and what the political structure is and what the maturity level is.
I wanted to go back up a little. There was a question just before that. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. Lisa, I think, asks, if I'm a content manager in a company that's maturity level is maybe level 2, what's the best way to champion content strategy and also do what I need to do in my realm, which is for her is customer support?
I think the best thing to do is to get that business case. What is, if you're in customer support, is there a number of, is there a metric that says, people are returning these types of products for these types of reasons, and we don't have the content on the website to support them? Is there a metric that says, self-support has gone down, or we want to, the level of self-support for our company is 20% below the industry average or something like that. Anything with a hard number like that can start to get people's attention and allow you to start to build a project or a process around that. And then again, if you're at level 2, also being really, really aware of what's your sphere of influence. And that is sort of like, what's the highest level executive or director that oversees the process, the systems and processes you want to impact, and try and keep everything within that part of the hierarchy, if at all possible. Because then then you've got some sway, and hopefully you can get everybody on the same page. Once you get to levels 3 and certainly to level 4, then it gets a lot easier to move across those organizational boundaries. Yeah.
Customer support, I think, gets a real short end of the stick. You can see the chip on the shoulder. People sell things, and they're not always factually correct in the statements they make when they sell it. And then you have to support it, and people are like, I thought it could do this, and it doesn't, and that's and then you have to deal with all those support phone calls of, now that it doesn't do this, how do I work around it? And, it's considered a cost center because it doesn't bring in money, but like, it saves the company anyway. So the best way to champion content, I believe that most call centers keep track of every call that comes in and what it's about, and how long it took to answer the problem, what the answer was. And some of those, as Jerry is saying, what's the self-service that people could have done versus what they did do? Is that answer on the support website somewhere? And if it is, why couldn't the person find it? Maybe they don't use the web. Maybe they just want to talk to a human being. But some people, they will call in and they'll say, I tried to use your website and I couldn't find the answer because your website is so bad. All of those statistics can lead into, hey, maybe we should have a better structure, or maybe people might say, I found the content, but I couldn't understand it, or I found the content, but it didn't answer my question. These are key indicators that something is wrong with the structure or the content itself. And doing it's a pilot project around rewriting, restructuring a certain section of your support content, and seeing how the calls change, go down. Maybe you get the same amount of calls, but maybe the questions are more complicated. People say, I already tried to read your website. I did what the website said, but now I still can't fix my problem. That's what I have to say about that.
And call centers are also a fantastic example of how the technical and the editorial content strategies really come into play. Because chances are in a call center, you're going to have a lot of information about why that person called.
Yeah.
Probably know who they are, what product they're looking for, what the problem was, when they called in, probably what feature they were doing. There's all these things you can know about them, all of which is hopefully captured, or much of which is hopefully captured in metadata. And that metadata needs to be available to support the content strategy. If you're running metrics on which products are gathering the most calls or which features are gathering the most calls, that can help feed the content strategy of when to create content and how to, when do we create content, or how do we know that we don't have enough content or we have too much content. So that's, that support is such a great example in many ways, but all the metrics you can get from it are can be really powerful in telling your story.
Yeah, I didn't do this for the client, but I had one client who they always got calls about the bill, the utility bill, and people would be like, I cannot figure out how you calculated it. And so it led them to not only redesigning their bill, the paper bill or the PDF bill, but redesigning the bill section of the website to explain it. And of course, their calls went down.
We had another one, looping back to the maturity issue. Heidi's asking about, how can you see buy-in from business stakeholders on like workshops and audits and other activities to kind of move from that accidental grassroots level of maturity to a more mature stages?
I think I can start, but
yeah.
I think this really comes down to understanding that business case. What is the business story we need to tell? My background is in taxonomies, and I can tell you that trying to sell taxonomy to an executive is it's not easy. So I wouldn't talk about taxonomies. I talk about stitching content together. And it's the same thing for some of these things. It might not be that you want to talk about content strategy, but you want to talk about getting more efficient, using your content creation dollars more efficiently, or having better targeted content, or being more responsive with your content. So, I think most people on the call here are pretty sympathetic to the idea of content strategy, but if you can describe what you're doing without using the word content strategy, and certainly without using the word taxonomy, I highly recommend it. And it forces you to turn your story into a more business-focused story as well.
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever had success being like, excuse me, but you need a taxonomy to fix all your problems. Yeah, I have regaled people with content audits and taxonomy audits, and they'll be like, I do not give a poop about it. They have no idea what I'm talking about. But in terms of like buy-in on workshops and stuff, it can be really tough when I am always coming as somebody coming from the outside in, who's saying, you need to do, if you work with me, we're doing this workshop, and we're going to do this research, and that's the kind of project I want to work on, and I have the luxury to do that. As an internal person, it can be very difficult to get that leverage. And I always think that if I was ever an employee again, I would just ask the VP or director or manager I didn't even know. I'd be like, can we go out to lunch together? Can we have coffee together? Because just, to get to know them on a more friendly basis, even though it's intimidating, and even though they may never ask you in return, but to build those relationships. And I'm not big on relationships, although I need to be, but as an introvert and somebody who likes taxonomy spreadsheets, I'd just like to do the work. But also realizing that relationships are also open a door to talking about problems or hearing about somebody's problems and how you can help them.
And I think that leads to a really important point too, which is that the hardest part of these problems is the political and the social components of them.
Yeah.
Within the organization, and moving those things forward, because that's really where these things are. Those things need to be addressed one way or another. And socializing, and again, having a clear business case, showing people how what you're going to do is going to make their lives better and not worse. Those types of things are all really important in a project like this, even though they didn't really show up in any of our diagrams.
I'm going to jump in just to say that, to the point that Gary just made, that's true, especially with governance, right? So, when you are trying to sort of impose some structure or some rules on an unruly crowd, that, that political aspect is much harder than saying, we're going to set this flag in the CMS to make you review your content, or we're going to, restrict your access to certain things or whatever. If you don't have that you haven't sort of solved the politics of that, that can be a really thorny organizational challenge.
Yeah, if you look at that, the change management, what is it, curve, where it goes up, everybody's excited, and then it dips really low, and then it goes back up. It's those people who are, I use the word today, intransigent, who make that change process even harder. So winning them over, or at least helping them feel heard in some way, could really help move your project along the change curve faster.
I want to circle back.
Absolutely.
Sorry, go ahead. Laureen didn't phrase this as a question, but I'm curious about it too. She says, I'm curious about how that vest example worked out in the end. What was the resolution of that?
Well, they were managing that content in 3 different systems. And they needed, so when we started with them, they were in the process of trying to consolidate their system. So it's not like, they knew that they needed to, just because it was so unruly. But the result of our work was they were able to start moving things into one system. Our work showed that it was even more important to do that. But this is an example where one of the systems they had was an old COBOL system. I mentioned COBOL before, which is very archaic. No one really knew. Everyone was scared to touch it because they're afraid they were going to break it, type of thing. And so we had to work around that, but at the same time try and get everything going in the same direction. So they were able to get content into. They were able to reduce the number of systems that happened in. It also meant they needed to change the way that they were organized, their org structure to support that. Because even just having everything in the same system doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has the same goal when they're writing. So the goals of the writers need to be in alignment with with each other. Even though writing copy for the web is going to be different than writing copy for a catalog, which is going to be different than writing copy for a hang tag, they still needed to, everyone still needed to have the same sort of understanding of the West Marine brand and understanding of the direction of that particular product and how they were selling it. So it's, the content strategy, the taxonomy work was pretty well, I won't say straightforward, but that was the easy part. The organizational change and the system change was really where the difficulties were.
Yeah, it totally reminds me. I did this taxonomy for this forklift company, and they had taxonomies and what you can learn. I swear to God, if I went on Jeopardy, I would win. I did a taxonomy for a forklift production manufacturer, and they had different offices around the world, and then they had and those different countries have different terms for different kinds of forklifts, different terms for the same kinds of forklifts. And so we would have these conversations about, what is that forklift called? Is it this pneumatic thing, or anyway? And then how do you, in a product taxonomy, do you want to include your product attributes in the taxonomy, or should that be recorded separately? Anyway, those were some really interesting phone calls about what do you call things? And so my point being is that taxonomies drive a lot of discussions around inconsistency in terminology in the organization. And sometimes you can decide, and people will adopt a term, but they need to make sure that it's cascades throughout the organization. Yeah.
It terrifies me how many very large organizations don't even have a definitive list of their products.
It's hard.
it is hard, but so yeah, that happens a lot.
It's hard because of the people, right? Because they can't agree, or different countries or whatever.
Yeah.
It's always about people. It comes up all the time. We're really therapists and org behavior managers as much as content people.
Yeah, definitely.
Hey, Anu asked, saved the really easy question for last. I want to put this in. How do you sell content strategy when the reality is things are going to get worse before they get better?
Well, when a lot of my projects, people want content strategy. This is a terrible answer, but if I was an employee and they didn't want content strategy, I might try and find another job. But that's just a terrible answer. I know it's not possible for a lot of people, but I don't have a good answer to that, but maybe Gary does.
I think in a situation like that, I'd just find like the smallest unit of work you can do, and not like not do the least amount of work, but like find the smallest little thing that you've got control over, and just start from there. Yeah. The nice things about these projects I've found is that once they get momentum, if they get momentum and the organization recognizes the momentum and will put the funding and the resources behind it, they can take on a sort of an organic life of their own. Again, if the organization appreciates what's happening with them, and then all of a sudden the wins start to get a little bit easier. But yeah, find that smallest, most basic thing that people are, that fold in the rug that people keep tripping over every day. Just find that simple thing that everyone knows is a problem and see if you can start making progress there, which again is not a very good answer, but it's.
Yeah, but I've had situations where, we've done something small, and then later somebody is like, oh, wow, I saw that thing on the website. Who did that? And can we do that too? And it kind of snowballs from there.
Well, Paula, we're coming up close to wrapping here. Did you have anything last, or any other? Feel free, if you have a last question, drop it in the chat now.
Great questions, everyone, and great conversation. And so much of it, definitely, rings true. I think it's interesting, having been, I think I've been a consultant and I've worked in-house, and, the politics are there in either case, right? And it is interesting to sort of, it really does often come down to those those people aspects of it. And so that definitely, is resonating. I don't, beyond that, all I would say is thank you so much, Theresa and Gary. Great conversation. Great information. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight.